Ladies and gentlemen, the South African government announced that they were about to launch a space mission to the sun. Meshuggah. Everybody claimed you're going to be burnt up. They said, don't worry, we're going to launch it at night. Durban was a long, dark night that fell over the expectations of post-apartheid South Africa. Think back just 7 years to the so-called millennium of stable stock markets and peace processes, when we seemed to be facing the Jewish condition and the human condition almost a messianic period, a welcome for the Jewish state into the community of nations. Am lavadad yishkon, a people that shall dwell alone, was to be all a goyim, a light unto the nations. And then came the Intifada, Durban, 9/11, and a new global threat to Jewish survival and to the human condition. At the UN World Conference Against Racism in September 2001, anti-Semitic propaganda reached its post-Holocaust peak. I was the only Jew elected to the NGO Forum International Steering Committee of the Durban Conference. As such, I'd participated in all of the prepcoms in the preceding 2 years in Geneva, in Strasbourg, Santiago, Warsaw, etc., where we worked on revisionism, Holocaust education for the draft documents. I was denied a visa for the last prepcom, which took place in Tehran, and we arrived in Durban to find a couple of identity thefts. For example, there were now 3 Holocausts: slavery in America, continuing transatlantic slavery, and the Nakba. There was no Jewish Holocaust. There were 2 anti-Semitisms, to quote Professor Hadi Adham of Tehran University. Till 1945, anti-Semitism focused upon Jewish stereotypes, the Jewish banker, the Jewish communist, but with the victory of Zionism, since 1948, anti-Semitism focuses on the Arab oil sheik and the Islamist terrorist. Therefore, anti-Semitism is Arabophobia, and Zionism is anti-Semitism. Eventually, I was expelled from the International Steering Committee. I was called the World Jew, but I was able to attend the final session 2 months after Durban in Geneva. There, a 10-year program distilled from the Durban Plan of Action was presented as a route map until Durban II. It was an 8-point plan to isolate Israel as the last bastion of apartheid. It was modeled on the campaigns against apartheid South Africa of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, educational programs, legal suits against Israelis for crimes against humanity, a law of return for all Palestinian refugees, a renewed economic boycott. And sports, telecommunications, academic, scientific, cultural tourism, embargoes, the rupture of diplomatic relations, and measures against those states or NGOs that refuse to comply. All of these steps were to involve the churches, universities, media, especially the internet, trade unions, NGOs, and all United Nations agencies. Sound familiar? This is what we've been through for the past 7 years. The plan also focused on the great Satan, the United States, for its crimes of globalization, and a campaign for reparations for the slavery Holocaust. The 8-point plan also became a module, next invoked at the UN World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg in 2002, an ecological conference, then at the Anti-Globalization World Social Forum, born in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 2003. I was present with 70,000 representatives of 5,500 NGOs from 126 countries, many who had been active in Durban, crying, screaming, "Viva the Global Intifada," with intriguing banners calling for Nazis, Yankees, Jews, no more chosen peoples. And through its satellites, especially the European Social Forum, the Durban Agenda has become a mantra via BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel. Durban thus persists, but the scars were reopened 2 months ago at the UN Human Rights Council Durban II Prepcom in Geneva, moving on in the very same week to the European Parliament in Brussels, where it was taken over by the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights for the Palestinian People. The Israel-bashing states in Geneva were setting the traps for Durban II, while the dress rehearsal was taking place in Brussels. The hall was packed with the very NGOs that had turned Durban I into an anti-Semitic hate fest. One after another, they stepped up to the plate to play the numbers game. 2 anti-Semitisms of Durban I reverted to 1. The Libyan chair back in Geneva said since 2001 there's been a growth in anti-Semitism against Muslims. 3 Holocausts were now 1. As the United States chair of the Palestine Solidarity Committee said, 15 May 2008 is not Israel's 60th Independence Day. It must be promoted as the 60th year of the Nakba to be launched at the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre in January 2008. Some more math. 40 years of apartheid occupation now comes to an end. It's now replaced with a new campaign of 60 years of colonial occupation to be launched on the 29th of November, Palestine Day. Some try to slip in even 90 years of Zionist colonialism since Balfour. Further numbers. The lip service at Durban 1 was still to two states living side by side. But to quote in Brussels, Palestine Authority Minister Mustafa Barghouti, a one-state solution is now necessary without apartheid in that state, i.e. Judenrein. Under the slogan Al-Nakba, Al-Auda, catastrophe to return, 2008 projects include a Nakba Museum Archival Center as a place for memory and education modeled on Yad Vashem, an international marathon from exile to places of origin, concerts in major cities modeled on Live Aid, a global campaign for sympathizers to send old keys for an itinerant exhibit symbolizing abandoned homes. And finally, a regatta to set sail from still undecided embarkation points to break through Israeli maritime controls to Gaza, supposedly replicating the 1948 Exodus ship of Jewish Holocaust refugees, identity theft. The principal campaign still remains the formula enunciated at Durban 1, BDS. And I asked the convener, Senegal's Ambassador Paul Badji, the chair of the UN Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinians, does this body, the UN, endorse the innumerable campaigns of BDS presented at the conference? He replied, we do not endorse, nor do we condemn. Indeed, not a word of condemnation was uttered by the members of the European Parliament or the UN officials who provided the logistics and sat through the Israel bashing. The UN and the European Parliament had been hijacked by hate mongers. Both must now share the responsibility for potentially violent consequences on the road to Durban too. The World Social Forum, the European counterparts, Brussels, etc., these are depressing experiences to sit through. But I sit through them because being present at such brainstorming on how to most effectively harm the State of Israel provide useful insights into the campaigns, the calendar, vectors and tactics of the principal enemies of the Jewish state. I'd like to end with four brief proposals. Countermeasures. The first is divide and rule by empowerment of the aggrieved. Many NGOs are frustrated at providing window dressing for politically hijacked agendas. Even in the anti-globalization movement, the World Social Forum, by focusing on the legitimate grievances of globalization, such as child labor or trafficked women, the golem can be exposed. As we saw only, I think, 2 days ago, the General Assembly rejected a resolution on state rape. You, I'm sure, saw that. But we have to expose these things. Secondly, being there. Being there, I think, is extremely important because, just an example, at a UN interfaith meeting, the Syrian ambassador said that there were present in this hall representatives of an arrogant faith community that calls itself divinely elect and therefore racist and should be expelled. I approached two of my sister human rights organizations to walk out with me. They refused. I packed my books, dropped them very noisily, deliberately, walked out, and 3 minutes later walked back to my place because you cannot leave a vacuum to be filled by the enemy. You must be there, wir seien da. But I think that exposure, for example, exposure on boycott. Boycott affects the very delicate fabric of functional economic interdependence. It violates articles of the World Trade Organization and the European Union, and therefore these are paradigms for others. They must be stressed. Terrorism. Simon Wiesenthal's dictum was that what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. We see that what happened in the years 1980 to 82, 73 shootings and bombings of Jewish targets in Western Europe, of which 29 in France, it ended in 1982 with an unforeseen byproduct of the Israeli entry into the southern Lebanon. European terrorists being trained at the Palestinian bases in southern Lebanon fled and were repatriated. When they got home, they didn't attack Jewish targets. They needed money. They attacked banks, NATO installations, embassies. Governments cracked down. It was the end of Baader-Meinhof, the Red Brigades, Action Directe. What started with the Jews became a general scourge. And finally, on this point, I think that no one likes their freedom of expression curbed. Today, there is a juridical jihad on expression. on limits and intimidation